everyone. Welcome back to the How to Podcast series. I have a guest co-host on the podcast who's a podcaster. Imagine that. And Brandon's on the show to talk about his podcast. He and I were just chatting before we hit record that things are going well. Up to 11 episodes so far and many, many more to come. Brandon's here to talk about his journey as a podcaster. My guest co-host, Brandon. Hey, welcome to the How to Podcast series.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you for having me. I am super excited to be on your show. This is a show that really helped me launch my podcast. And so if I can give back in any way to listeners that are trying to learn to take that first step, I'm not that far down the journey, just 11 episodes in, but man, I wish I would have been doing this a year ago. Just the value that this podcast has brought to me as a person and my personal growth, my professional growth. I can't wait to share about it.
I love it. Okay, well, let's start at the beginning. Tell everybody, Brandon, about your show, the name of your podcast, what's it all about? Give us an idea of your show.
Yeah, I am the host of the Poultry Leadership Podcast. This is a podcast dedicated to the farmers, folks that are in the barns taking care of the chickens and maybe don't have access to the same resources, let's say, that the leadership team has, where they go to these conferences, they get to see all these great speakers, and they miss out. The future leaders of the industry that I get to be part of, they're missing out. And so I found a gap. I got to dive right into it. So yeah, Poultry Leadership Podcast. It's really exciting.
Now, okay, in Canada we say niche. You guys, I guess in the States they say niche. But talk about finding your spot. Like, right, you could be talking about farming, which is so broad. You're like really narrowly focused. That's amazing.
Yeah, it's interesting when I started this whole journey, like identifying who our target audiences had to match basically what my target business is for work as well. My everyday job is I'm a commercial account director for prison controls. So I sell poultry controls, and I'm trying to find new ways to reach my customers, find out their needs, find out the challenges that they have. And what's interesting is we've always called ourselves subject matter experts, Dave. And nobody was calling us to give presentations at association events. Nobody was reaching out to us to speak. And it's like, why is that? So that was one of the motivating factors, besides finding the niche of, okay, so my target audience is the poultry folks that are sitting there, right there, the managers, the upcoming people, as well as maybe allied folks that are like me when I got started 5 years ago in the industry, just needed to learn the language. You think chickens would be easy to talk about. There are so many so much terminology that I wasn't aware of. Pullets and layers and breeders and you name it. There's terminology. Well, how does someone get up to speed quickly with that terminology? Well, our guests that I have on our show for the Poultry Leadership Podcast, they bring that terminology just in the conversational speak. So it makes sense. And it's not all about terminology, but they get to, understand egg prices and understand upcoming events and, going after those leaders or those speakers at upcoming events and saying, hey, do you want to give a preview of your presentation on my podcast? And maybe we can fill the convention or your educational seminar with folks that have already aware of what you're going to speak about, but they're more engaged walking in the door. That's been hugely valuable. That was really valuable right off the bat. So
I love it. Okay, so with a niche the way you have, there's got to be like conferences, events, conventions all around what you guys do. Any thought about connecting up your podcast to a convention or a meeting, things like that, where you can be the voice of the convention at all for your podcast?
Well, I started down that road right away. I reached out to upcoming events, International Poultry and Processing Expo. It's in Atlanta every year. And this year was their largest year. I mean, it's huge. If you take the Congress Center in Atlanta and you just fill it full of all kinds of technology and equipment, from silos to cage equipment to us as technology people. But you're talking that entire huge exhibit hall. Well, what I did ahead of time is I reached out to their director and said, hey, do you want to be on the podcast? And so we started talking ahead of time, getting the idea of what, so he could highlight his show, but I needed it to be more for my audience than just a commercial for his show, because nobody wanted to hear an hour-long commercial for this show. But what I was able to pull out was the fact that here's a guy who is a developing leader, or not development, he's a very solid leader in the industry. That's how he got the role he got. But he was able to share some of the things that he's overcome in his journey, not only in the industry, for the poultry industry, but also in the show, the exhibit world, and to show it's not all roses when you're trying to do a trade show. There's a lot of work that goes into it. Yeah. And so through the preview, through that conversation, he was really able to connect with me. And then what happened at the show when it happened was the connection I had with him opened up a lot of opportunities for conversations with this guy that I would have never had. I was one of 30,000 people there, but yet he went out of his way to find me and to make sure that everything was going well, and was still thankful for the time that I spent with him regarding his trade show. So yeah, that's one of my goals. There's a lot of events and I like to highlight those. Whether I become the voice of that event or not, I don't know. It's going to take some time.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking even if there's like a way you can work with the event planner and get a discount code for the event that you could promote on your podcast. Everybody use Brandon, or use Chicken, or use whatever code that comes unique for you and your podcast as you promote it. You just in the day-to-day conversation in your show. It doesn't have to be a commercial, air quotes around commercial. It can just be in your general conversation. That I'm going to be going to this event in September. Would love to meet you there. If you're there, check it out. I'll be wearing my podcast shirt. Make sure you walk up to me and talk to me at the event. But if you want to go, there's a coupon code here, and it's this blah, blah, blah. And then that kind of connection with the event, you're talking about it, promoting it, you're supporting them as well. It kind of all works together. Right?
Yeah, that event was a great opportunity either way. What I did is I went and created some little business cards that I put right alongside my business card. And as I networked throughout, trying to business development for my company, I was able to just have these conversations with folks and say, hey, can we talk about this on the podcast? And man, I have a list of like 20 future guests that I'm working on lining up for the show. So there's no content that I'm missing there. I mean, I've got plenty of content to work through for the show, which for a niche show, a lot of folks are like, man, you're going to run out of content quick. Well, what I found was, what's the original goal? Okay, so there's a little bit more content here. There's an issue here that I can talk about. And you just start building that directory of content. And then when you look ahead for a couple of weeks, you go, I got a couple gaps. Let me reach out to that person that wanted to, jump in on the podcast. And then once you open it up and say, hey, I'm looking for guests on the podcast, and you even promote that anywhere, I've had no problem with people reaching out to me and saying, hey, I'd love to promote my upcoming event on your podcast, which is great. Some of them have worked out, and some of them I never really went to recording on, just because it didn't make sense.
Yeah. Good. One thing I want to talk about a little bit as well is around promoting your show and engaging with your audience. So we talked about this, Brandon, before we hit record, that there's someone listening to this and they're here to learn as well for their show. So I'm going to do exactly what we talked about. Okay, so for you listening right now, I'm going to ask Brandon a question that's really important for you to ask anyone who reaches out to you in your show. Please do this. Please ask this question. Brandon, my question for you is, how did you even find my show in the first place?
That's a great question to ask people who are listening to your show. How did they find you? Because it definitely helps figure out what's going to plug in. For your show, I was on iTunes. I was getting ready to go for a run, and I said, man, I got to figure out this whole podcasting thing. Let me do a Google search for how to start a podcast. I didn't care where the show came from, didn't care which industry. I wanted to find a podcast for people just getting started. And so in that case, your podcast was straight up on iTunes.
Wow.
And the Apple first one there jumped in on it. And I'm a skeptic. I listen to, I've heard some bad podcasts out there, and this one's like, you know what, this is engaging. It was engaging enough for that. When I went for my run, by the time I came back, I'm like, okay, I got to listen to episode 2, 3, subscribe to it. I want this regularly feeding me as I'm in this feeding frenzy of information, trying to tuck in my brain about how to start a podcast. And then, of course, I reached out to you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just read the email again today before we jumped on. I'm like, there's Brandon's original email. I'm like, oh, this is so cool to have that. So again, the reason why I asked the question of anyone who's ever interacted with my show is your answer is what I want to do more of. Right. So if I spend 20 hours a week in Facebook and nobody says, Dave, I found your show through Facebook, then maybe I could redirect that 20 hours I'm spending somewhere where it's not giving me results to focus on where it is. So to hear your answer then redirects my focus to where I should do more of, because it worked. We're talking. So I want to do more of that. So that's the reason why I'm asking.
Yeah. The big way that my podcast spread was through the guests I had, whether that was a guest that was tied to an event, where that event shared the podcast to its mailing list of 40, 50, 100,000, whatever. That sure does help. But a lot of it's been word of mouth. A lot of it's been, hey, I'm growing. I want to learn. And someone else will, hey, I heard about this podcast over there. And so just encouraging that. But the guests that I have, I picked some really great guests that have media connections, that have huge audiences, and they're also well known in our industry. So it's just been very targeted specifically towards those folks. And I've seen the results in the stats, so to speak.
Yeah. Another thing I'm thinking for you as well, I grew up in Northern Ontario, Canada. My friend had a farm, so I would go out to his farm on weekends and we worked. Like I'd be on the tractor for, 10 hours straight, plowing fields and doing hay and everything. And the idea of having something with me to keep me company, you could download your podcast in there and then not have to worry about Wi-Fi and data and all this stuff and listen to your show. So you have a captive audience who are looking for content around what they do. And I think if you had, for example, your business card up at a feed store, if farmers come in to get their feed and all their supplies and, there's a podcast about poultry. Well, hey, who would have thought? I'm going to check that out. Maybe it's going to help me with my business, with my farm. So any of those little things that you can do outside of, email marketing or websites and all that kind of stuff, but just in person, like that kind of interaction with people. Again, the events are great. Being there and rubbing shoulders with people who are your audience, this is the best way to get more listeners for your show.
It definitely is. Social media has been, I'm going to say, okay. My network of folks, I get a lot more feedback from folks that probably found it on my social media because I post about it at least once a week. I don't post, I don't beat the same episode up 100 times, just once a week. LinkedIn and Facebook. I'm trying to get a Instagram going. But as I've learned in listening to your show, making sense is, podcasters are going to go to where podcasters are. And that's typically in the iTunes. And so focusing on that search function there seems to work really, really well. I did pay for some advertising around one of the big trade shows in town. I said, hey, I want to reach anybody within 100 miles of Atlanta with an ad for the show that's on Facebook that has a very specific passion around poultry.
Yeah.
And because I knew that week the audience was going to go, 30,000 strong. And we got some good traffic into our website. I host my podcast website on my work website as a subdomain of the work website. So that way, good. The sponsor who pays me to do this, I'm waiting to get paid to do this, who allows me to do this, is able to benefit from that as well through traffic on their website. That gives me a lot better statistics on what social media is doing versus, let's say, iTunes or any of those. They don't really give me that source.
Yeah. The one thing too, Brandon, to think about when you go to events is that maybe an idea for you as the host of the show, excuse me, is to have like a shirt or something with your podcast on it, with maybe like a little QR code that people can just put their phone on and click it and right to your show. I have one on the back of my shirt says you're following a podcaster, because we always say follow the show, right? So now you're following a podcaster. So as in line while we're going to get tickets or I'm waiting for the next booth, there's someone standing behind me. I'm not even interacting with them, but they're behind me. And what do you do when you read the person's shirt in front of you, because you're just standing there waiting and you're like, wait, this guy's got a podcast? There's a little code. I can just snap my phone and now, oh, I got Brandon's show on my phone right now in front of me. Hey, tap, tap on the shoulder. You're a podcaster? Like, you're just walking around just doing your thing through. You're going to have sponsors walk up to you and go, hey, are you looking for somebody to sponsor your podcast, Brandon? I would love to be a part of this. Can I come on your show? I got a guest for you. You know, and just by wearing the shirt, you don't have to be all flashy, but just making it evident. I'm a podcaster and I podcast about everything you see in this building right now. So talk to me. That's following a podcaster.
That's a great idea. And the only challenge I have with it is when I'm at those shows, my primary role is my job that I'm there for. And so it's a real balance. And I have to even balance of where I bring that up in a conversation with a customer or something like that, because I don't want my team to say, wow, Brandon's all about the podcast and he's not about maybe selling the next thing in our industry. So I just have to be careful around that. But it was really awesome when I walked into one of the local bars around the exhibit hall, and one of the guys at the bar who knows me, but I never told him I'd done a podcast. He's like, hey, you do a podcast. I've been listening. I'm like, you're the first person to tell me that, about my podcast without me having to tell them about my podcast. That's pretty darn cool. So
that's nice.
So it does get out. It's just less in your face in our industry. It's included with every e-blast that our company does for any of our products. Good. It's, and we have a pretty substantial list of people that would benefit from it. So over time, if they can, catch it and listen to it, I don't know what big numbers I'm going to really get. I mean, we only have probably about 10,000 people, maybe that are dedicated to layers, maybe 20,000 people, but to actually get, a huge subscriber list, I'm pretty happy with where we're getting the numbers at already. If I could reach 30, 40 people a week, that's 30 or 40 people that I'm not spending $10,000 to reach. So,
right. I love it. Okay. So Brandon, there's people listening to the show. They haven't even got to the point of episode 1 yet. They're struggling maybe a little bit. They're hitting record. They're hitting delete. They're a little stuck. And they're envious of someone with 11 episodes. They're like, I wish I could say I have 11, but I don't. Your thoughts to that listener, that new podcaster that's trying to find their feet under them. What do you say?
Keep it simple to begin with. So why I say that is what kept me from getting, I know where they are. I had the idea 6 months before I actually did it. So I understand, and there was fear, and I'm not afraid of anything, but for some reason, this whole, why me? Why would I want to do this? And getting over that fear, what I did is I set myself up for success for the first episode by finding a guest, because I knew what I wanted. It was an interview style podcast. This wasn't just me preaching to an imaginary audience for an hour. This was me bringing in really good guests that people wanted to hear their stories. So I found my first guest. I set it up so we were going to be together. We'd had some good conversations at a time, and I'm like, hey, let's just record this. And he was really cool about it. Went through, recorded, and he'd done a lot more work in preparation than I expected. I'd given him the list of questions we were going to cover, but man, that dude had it down. And just that champion to help me made it so much easier, but I kept it simple. I had my laptop, I had Audacity, I had a microphone that I'd bought to replace my microphone on my computer because when that broke. And So I took that out there. I didn't even have a really good pair of headphones because it really didn't matter at that point to me. And I just sat the microphone down between us and I hit record. Had the conversation, didn't even have an intro yet. I did have a name. I did have a focus. But that was all, I can get into that in a minute on how that was all created. But I just recorded. And then I just so happened to say, okay, now I got to get this out of here. So I listened to your show and you'd given me a couple tools like the Adobe podcast was just in beta. And so I'm like, you know what, for $10, let's try it. Cause I don't know anything about leveling audio. And I'd heard tin can audio, I'd heard podcasts of all levels. And I'm like, you know what? I don't care what the first one sounds like other than I need to make it so we're not a bunch of blubbering idiots, whatever. Yeah. So I went through and I cleaned it all up. I made a bunch of mistakes, but I cleaned it all up and I sent it to him. Just sent it back to the guy and said, hey, what do you think of this? Hey, we just recorded this. And I sent it on to another friend who was also in podcasting. And, he's like, dude, it sounded just fine. And I had no intro song. I had no real way of doing it. I came back, I added a little bit of an intro and a little bit of an outro. And then I just launched it. And I launched it softly. I didn't tell anybody about it, but I wanted to know how iTunes worked. I wanted to know how BuzzFeed, Buzzsprout works. Yeah. I wanted to know how those things worked. And I knew I couldn't do it unless I launched it. And that was the kickoff of this. And then I just made a plan and said, before I promote the show, I'm going to get to 3 episodes. I'm going to launch with 3. Got them recorded. Then by the time I got to the 3rd one, I'm like, let's play with some music here. Created our little intro for the Poultry Leadership Podcast, which of course has chickens in it.
Yes, of course.
And that was key because it's like, I like that little jingle. And I think that cost me $20 of music I paid for, on one of those sites, a little jingle site or whatever. And it was simple. I used Audacity to mix it. Didn't have to be perfect. But I had an intro, had an outro, at 3 episodes, launched, and promoted the show. And pretty soon, 50 listeners. Pretty soon, wow, we have 100. Wow, 200. And now we're up to over, I think I look at it last, how many episodes? Let's see, our big stats for all time, 559.
Nice.
And
it's amazing.
3 months.
Come on.
Yeah.
Right. So starting simple is your main takeaway. I love that. Because it gets overwhelming. You go into a Facebook group and you ask a question and you get 300 answers and they're all different. And you're like, oh, this is confusing. And then you have experts telling you got to spend $4,000 on this and you got to do this. And you got to jump through this hoop and you got to pat your head this way, rub your stomach that way. You're like, wait, I just want to record an episode. Like, can someone just make this simple? Because I'm getting overwhelmed by all this stuff.
And that's exactly where I was thinking I was missing something. It was too easy when I got done. And I talked to a good friend of mine, Brian, who, hosts a great show called the Bamboo Lab Podcast. He was the first person I ever got to interview with and be on his podcast. But he does it completely different than me. No editing. He has a recording device. He sits it between the phones and it sounds great. And then he has some ways of throws in his music and stuff. And I'm like, okay, there's a lot of ways to get to the same point. And I don't have to compare my podcast to yours. My stats are mine. They don't, I can't compare them to somebody on a music podcast or something that is a specific there. So it's all about what our goals are. And I set goals. Hey, I want this podcast to outrate the last one. This one, I'm going to try to, I'm not going to promote it on day one when I launch it on iTunes because I want to see how many subscribers we have versus how many people found it on the next day on LinkedIn or social media, stuff like that. So.
I like it. What else are you doing to help promote the show beyond the email lists and the business side of what you do? You talked about LinkedIn. Where else are you promoting the podcast and what's working for you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm working on some promotions with some of the media partners where they have a weekly release, an email release, and then they go and scour all of the podcasts that are out there. And then they picked up mine as one that can be released through their site. So it gives them content about what's going on in the industry. Heck, I found a bunch of podcasts I didn't even know existed. I couldn't even find them in search. I thought I was the only one for a while. Then all of a sudden, it's that blue van syndrome where you buy the blue van and now you see it everywhere. And it's like, okay, so there are a lot of podcasts, but mine definitely is different than the others. And I'm going to remain different than the others because it's one, no one else has branded Mulnix.
Yeah.
And that's the key to it. No one else has me as a guest or as a host. Yeah. And I'm definitely not talking the scientific lingo that most of those, because a lot of universities have podcasts, a lot of ag science programs have podcasts, which is great to teach those folks. I mean, it's a great platform. They have plenty of content, but a lot of it's scientific. And that's not my genre. I can't speak that intelligently.
No. So, Brendan, if no one could stand in your way, cross their arms, and shake their head no at your dream, what is your dream for the show? There's no limits. There's no boundaries. Anything could happen. What's your big vision for the podcast?
My big vision that would make me feel like I've accomplished everything was if I could have every major farm's story that's in my industry captured through an interview, to the history of that farm, to what they've learned through their growth and all the lessons that they've had learned. If I had every one of those farms hit, then I'd be happy. It has very little to do with number of guests or subscriptions or sponsorships. It has more to do with the original goal of sharing farm stories, hearing what the generation did ahead of time that they learned from, to then teach the next generation coming up so they don't do the same mistakes. And along the way, I'm hoping to, again, meet a bunch of new folks in the industry through this, connect with them that I wouldn't have had the same opportunity to connect with. And then ultimately one day, potentially hand this off to somebody on my team to be able to run with it within the company. So that way I can focus on, maybe starting a different podcast on something else, but who knows?
I love it. What about your listeners as far as where they are in the world? Is that something that you're thinking about or you're looking at and watching closely? Because you could have people in New Zealand listening, UK, and anywhere in the world, right?
Yeah, we've hit all continents but Australia. That the Pacific Australia is a continent down there. That's the only continent we're not on. In Antarctica. There's not too many chicken farms down there, so I'm okay with that. But I look at that and see, especially when I've been to an event that has a lot of folks maybe from a specific area, to say, hey, has my listenership gone up in, let's say, Brazil or South America, because we had a lot of those folks in during an event. That's been important to me. But until I've reached pretty much everybody in the U.S., that's my initial goal, is the U.S. where our market is. I got to remain focused on that, because it's exciting to have folks from Africa listening to my podcast. But I don't know if it's going to return the same value to them as it would here in the U.S., where you hear the story of different farms. You're going to value that more, and just the scale of our farming is different, and the problems that we deal with are a lot different. It's not and like my target audience isn't backyard chicken farmers. These are all commercial farmers that are producing, a lot of eggs that feed the world.
Yeah. And we talked about this before, but just before we jump off here, Brandon, the value of hearing from your audience, what that means to you as a host. Come on, share an example, and what did it mean to get that message coming to you?
Oh yeah. I mean, it hit me hard this week. When I opened up my LinkedIn and there was a message from a audience member who I had never met. We were connected on LinkedIn, but I had never met her in person. And she just shared her heart and said, hey, As a developing leader whose career has moved very fast, I've looked to resources like your podcast to help me learn the lingo, help me learn about individuals that one day I'm going to come across. And now I have a way of connecting with them based on your podcast. And just the thank you from the bottom of my heart. This podcast means a lot to me. And that was something that really meant a lot to me. I mean, because that was something I hadn't seen. I get kudos from my mom and dad because they're big listeners of the show, but they're going to be proud of me and sticking it up on their fridge just like anybody else as family. But when it comes to somebody that what is my target audience, a developing leader, that it meant something to them, and it's a tangible piece, the lingo, the people I'm bringing on the show for them to connect with, that made it all worthwhile.
I love it. It's good. And it's that same moment that we've had. You're ready to go for your jog. You hit play on an episode and go, I don't know if this is for me. I'll take a chance. Hopefully it serves me as a listener. It sounds like your audience member found the right podcast at the right moment. So it's kind of nice to hear that you get to experience the other side of that comment. You did that for me, and I really appreciate it. But now you got to get it back as well. So
yeah. Good. And when I used to listen to podcasts and they would talk about their heart letters or whatever, I'm like, that's just kind of, show offy a little bit and all that. I was really skeptical about it. Maybe it was jealousy. I don't know. Yeah, if I started a podcast, no one would write me a letter. But in this case, it was like when you got it, it was truly, it's the nitrous that wants to make you keep going. Yeah, and then what it did is I realized the value of giving that feedback. And that's why I reached out to you, Dave. That's why I've reached out to other friends that, are in this adventure together. It's like, guys, you deserve you deserve the feedback because you sacrificed all of this time to provide me that episode. I mean, you have 9 other podcasts that you're doing, but to bring content that's consistently solid is hard. It's not easy work. And wherever someone's at on their journey, especially you listeners, where you're trying to figure this out, you're trying to figure out what's your next step. You have whatever this episode is, but then you also have the previous episode, the previous guest, and the previous one, and that content's always available. I was thinking about that the other day, man. How many times were you on the news as a kid? And you're always excited. I'm on the news, and I got to record it. I got to, maybe, I'm at that Lego convention, and I got to record it. Wow, I had my second on air. It's gone.
Yeah,
that aired, never to be seen again the next day. And if you didn't record it, nobody knows it. A podcast is so much more powerful because a podcast, you get that story and you just put it online. Yeah, it can come off. I mean, it can go away if you really want to. But if it brings value, why would you ever remove it? 10 years from now, why would I remove it?
Right.
It's so important, podcast creators, because today you're also going to go and create your first episode of your podcast, listeners. It's okay to be the first episode. You don't have to knock it out of the park on that. What you have to do is you're knocking it out of the park by stepping up to the plate. That's what you're knocking it out of the park, because you can make a new episode number 1 down the road where you can, man, this one didn't work. I'm going to take that one off because I just hit like a bomb. Because I find whatever my episode 1 is the one that is the second. Right now it's the highest. It's 150 listens. Because people go from the current podcast, I'm going to go all the way back to number 1. And over time, I'll probably take out episodes that just are no longer relevant because I don't want to waste people's time with irrelevancy. But what I want them to do is be able to have the resources that are valuable to them. And so start episode 1 today. Go do it. Is it done yet? Is it done yet?
Yes, I love it. That's good, Brandon. I love it. Okay, let's go before we jump off again. The podcast, again, remind us where to find it. The website to get in touch with you, Brandon. And there's people that would love to chat with you and encourage you and also maybe be a guest or how we want to share your show. We want to love and support you. How do we do it?
Absolutely. Well, the easiest place to find it is type in any of the major players, iTunes, iHeart, or any of the major players. I think probably 50 players out there now, is the Poultry Leadership Podcast. It is the one and only Poultry Leadership Podcast. You can also find it at thepoultryleadershippodcast.com.
Of course.
That ties it back to my business page, prismcontrols.com, but it's there. Guests can reach out to me if you want to find me. I'm on all the socials except for Twitter and some of those weird, I'm not a TikToker or anything like that. But all you got to do is search Brandon Mulnix. There's one of me that I found in the world, and most of the things you find on there are true about me. I haven't found anything not true about me, and there's some pretty interesting articles out there. I've done some pretty crazy things, but you can find me on LinkedIn. I'd love to connect on LinkedIn. I'd love to help people. I'm a person that, once you've gotten, if you reach out to me asking for help, I give you the shirt off my back to make sure that I can connect you with somebody, or I can put you in, just give you a different perspective on it. I've gotten a few years under my belt where I know who and when to give advice to, but yeah, I definitely believe that if you're scared to start that first podcast and you just say, "Hey, Brandon, can you help me?" Not a problem. Dave gave me the 30 minutes way back when. I can definitely return that favor to any one of you listeners on this show.
I love it. Brandon, tell me about the image for your podcast. I love it. These chickens around the mic.
Well, I'm going to bring this topic up. Okay. In today's world, we have no excuses for not having we have all the tools possible to help us. So, Dave, let me tell you how I started my podcast. I totally forgot about this. That image was created by ChatGPT. I upgraded and started typing in, started giving it instructions. That's what it came up with probably after the 30th iteration. I loved it. It also goes in line with my personality of, suit wearing, rooster there. Had to throw a couple hens in. But I used ChatGPT. I used ChatGPT to help me come up with a name. I said, if I'm going to start a podcast for this genre, this market, what would you call it? Gave me 10 names. I then had to take those 10 names, throw them through GoDaddy. What websites are available? What works? Boom. GoDaddy said the Poultry Leadership Podcast is wide open. So I bought it right away. I didn't want to even blink. Yep. So, and then when I started getting down to finding who should I talk to, Dave, typed in, I have a podcast. It's called the Poultry Leadership Podcast. Who should I talk to? It didn't give me names of anybody, but it did give me titles, industries, professions, and a lot of crazy ideas that all made sense. Literally, I still have that list today. I copied it, pasted it into a Google Excel sheet. So that way, when I start drawing a blank of, what topics do I need to be covering? Which ones have I missed? Here's a good opportunity here. Then what questions should I ask? That one was a mix of, I'm talking to a person from a specific industry. Let me pull those questions in. And then I already had a pretty good list of solid questions that I like to ask, but I wanted to make sure that I always had questions that could go off into subtopics and make me speak a little bit more intelligent than I actually am. I faked it on that one. So the tools are there. I mean, and that just made it so much easier. Right. And forced me to use the tools because I was a little afraid of it all. But you know what? I go back and I use those tools every day. I just used it right before I jumped on the show. I created a LinkedIn post. Took my episode description, said, make me a LinkedIn post. Made me a LinkedIn post, copy, pasted it into LinkedIn. I'll make a Facebook post. And it gives me the hashtags, gives me so much information that I can't spend hours on this. I need to spend 20 minutes on this. Yeah. And if you're not using the tools that are out there, you're probably not a good enough writer most of the time, unless you're a really good writer, to write some of the stuff that the tools can help you with right away. Yeah. And that's my problem. Yeah. I was like, hey, I'm not smart enough for that.
So there it is, the Poultry Leadership Podcast, everyone. Make sure you go and listen to it. Like, subscribe, follow, share it with someone. Come on. You know someone who likes chicken. And it's Poultry in Motion is what it is. So make sure you go and check out the podcast and give Brandon some love. I see some ratings and reviews already. So I'm asking everyone here on the How to Podcast series to go support Brandon and his podcast. And Brandon, thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, Dave, thank you for having me.
It's excellent. All right, everybody. All information is in the show notes as always. Go give Brandon some love. Brandon, again, thank you so much. Hey, thanks for being here on the How to Podcast series. Glad to have you on the show with us, listening in, and hope they're finding value in the podcast. I hope you're finding something that helps you with your show, helps you with the tools and the information from these amazing guest co-hosts through our daily Daves and these solo episodes. The variety of what we're doing here on the podcast is all designed for you so that you can get the tools you need to create your podcast and keep going with your show. That's why we're here. That's why I'm doing this. And I'm glad you're here finding value in this. If you would like to do a little bit more than just be a listener, if you want to do community with podcasters, we have a thing called our Meetup on meetup.com. You can come find us, and there'll be a link on our website at howtopodcast.ca, and you can come and join in on our Meetup. Instead of just being a listener, you could actually participate and come in and join other podcasters, just like you, at your stage, at your level, where you're at right now. And then other podcasters who are maybe a little further down the road, who can learn from you and you can learn from them. And we host these meetups on a regular basis. Again, go to howtopodcast.ca and you'll find all the information there. We'd love for you to come join us at our next meetup. The only thing we need at our next meetup is you. You're the only thing missing from all of this. So consider joining our meetups. Again, they're totally free on a regular basis, all through howtopodcast.ca. And I'd love to hear more from you about your podcast as well. There's a SpeakPipe link on howtopodcast.ca. Leave a message. I'd love to hear about you and your show and how we can work together to get your message into the world. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for sharing the show with another podcaster that you're like, hey, I think you'd really like this episode. Go ahead, share the episode. Let's get more podcasters on the mic. Thanks for listening.